Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some findings from the research on what works to support adult media literacy in particular. But first of all, a little bit about the National Literacy Trust and who we are. We're one of the main literacy charities in the UK, where we've been supporting literacy in schools, families and communities for more than 25 years. Knowing that there's a strong link between poverty and poor literacy skills, a lot of our work is targeted in areas of disadvantage. We work hard, for example, to narrow the gap in reading attainment between children from poorer homes and their peers, so many of our programmes support schools with a high percentage of children eligible for free school meals. We also work within communities across the UK, building long-term partnerships that aim to break the cycle of disadvantage and low literacy, running events and programmes offering practical advice and support to families wherever they are, whether that's a park, a library, a shopping centre or a sports venue. Everything we do is underpinned by research carried out with thousands of children, young people and adults every year. Our research also informs our work with policymakers as part of our role as chairs of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Literacy. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group focuses on a different topic every couple of years, and in 2016 it was decided we should explore how best to support children and young people's critical literacy skills. We actually started looking into this area slightly ahead of the US election and the UK referendum as part of our ongoing interest in how technology is influencing literacy. But of course, it's become quite a hot topic. Among other things, what we learned from the Commission went on to help inform our later involvement as one of the partners of the Newswise programme that Angie described earlier. Before moving on to our research on adult media literacy, I did just want to touch briefly on why, as a literacy organisation, we feel it's so important to support critical digital and media literacy skills. As I said, we're really interested in how technology is redefining what it means to be literate. In fact, some commentators have even suggested that digital and media literacy are indivisible from, so need to be taught as literacy. But there is, of course, as many people have mentioned today, something of a plague of definitions of all these terms. And while we continue to work towards more potential shared definitions with other like-minded organisations, I think it's worth mentioning a couple of definitions very briefly, if only for me to highlight their shared foundation in critical literacy. One of the things I mean when I talk about critical literacy is the need to think more deeply about how our access to information is influenced by society and the environment we live in, about how being aware of things like issues of power and influence in a text is increasingly relevant in our digital age. Developing the critical thinking skills that help you to judge and evaluate the credibility of what you come across online supports both news and media literacy. And I really like the way this last definition neatly combines the theoretical background of critical literacy, its roots in a socio-political context, with the practical aspects of media literacy, such as developing the skills to find out if information is backed by evidence. Of course, many aspects of critical digital and media literacy are interlinked. So along with text-based definitions, there's some quite nice visual representations out there. And for me, it can also be helpful to separate the technical skills associated with digital literacy from the ability to analyse and appraise online information, which is at the heart of critical news and media literacy. But how do we increase these critical skills? And in particular, how might we support adults who are outside of compulsory formal education? This is something that we've been exploring in the research to see what the experts have to say about how best to address this significant challenge. The first thing to say is that there is a very strong consensus that this challenge really demands a partnership approach. So participants can benefit from the pooled skills, knowledge, resources and expertise of a wide variety of partners. This has been identified as a key feature of successful delivery in a number of important reviews over the years. For example, a foundational review in 2005 noted that partnerships between media organisations and community groups were essential if programmes were to have a lasting impact. More recently, a 2016 report mapping media literacy practice across the EU also found partnerships played a fundamental role in the most successful initiatives. And a report for the Council of Europe earlier this year observed that third sector and non-governmental organisations may be particularly well placed to help bring together industry, academia and policymakers. So this may sound like preaching to the converted, but I think it's worth mentioning because while it is often very fun, it can also take quite a lot of work to develop and sustain effective partnerships. So I think it's important to know that this cross-disciplinary working does contribute to successful and impactful delivery. Moving on to the format and content of good media literacy initiatives, what does the research tell us works on the ground? Well, one heartening thing I wanted to start with was that a 2012 review of global media literacy interventions concluded that they were generally effective. And while that might be something that we'd all hope and expect to be the case, not all research reviews find positive impacts in whatever they're looking at. So I did want to mention that. Another thing that this review found was that programmes that didn't try to do too much at once were the most successful. So the takeaway there is that there's no harm in keeping things simple. Looking at some more qualitative research, a number of reports have suggested that offering informal, flexible, drop-in sessions and events, especially those that include producing news as much as consuming news, provide adults with practical and effective ways of developing their media literacy skills. I believe this particular piece of research in the middle related to library settings, but the principles could apply equally to other community venues. Some earlier research also found that adults felt more engaged in critical media literacy learning when it involved a facilitated discussion. So including this in adult-facing community-based approaches might also be a good idea. Several other reviews and studies have made practical recommendations for the learning that should be included in effective interventions based on their findings. Two recommendations that appear frequently are providing insight into the concept and impact of misinformation and teaching the practical skills that adults need to know to verify facts. For example, a wide-ranging report for the Council of Europe suggested that media literacy initiatives should provide insight into the threat of information disorder, as they called it. For example, how it can sow distrust and division, while supporting journalistic initiatives that teach decent fact-checking and verification skills, as we were hearing about earlier. Similarly, an Indonesian study recommended that media literacy initiatives should increase awareness of how information on social media is produced and the consequences of sharing misinformation, but at the same time provide adults with support and advice about effective fact-checking. Related but also somewhat more controversial ideas from some studies suggest that teaching people how fake news is created and for what purpose might contribute to demystifying the concept of misinformation. And indeed, a recent randomised study in the Netherlands found that after playing a fake news game using tactics inspired by fake news producers, young people's perception of the reliability of fake news articles was reduced. Similar effects were found when the game was launched online, when it again reduced the perceived reliability of fake news and without affecting how users ranked real news. In terms of examples of effective messaging, at the moment, many messages can be seen to remind us to slow down. These examples are from either side of the Atlantic. So we have Namle's slowing down, finding the source, exploring media as a creator, and understanding bias. And then underneath we have the Newswise programme's Fabulous News Navigator, reminding us to stop, question, check, and decide. And research does show that taking time to think, we heard earlier about the 7-second rule, which I thought was brilliant, but taking time to think and indeed deliberate about a headline or a story you're not sure about is an effective way of reducing belief in false news headlines while not affecting outcomes in relation to real news, which is what we want, the best of both worlds. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour, a few highlights from the expert advice on effective ways to improve adult media literacy skills as drawn from the research. However, one important aspect I haven't spoken about yet are some of the barriers to engaging adults in learning. I'm not going to say much about this because that anticipates our next session, but aside from not having the captive audience that we have when we're working in schools, and beyond taking into account the obvious work and family pressures that most adults face, it's worth noting that in a recent survey, 2/5 of UK adults said they weren't actually interested in learning new skills. So we also know things like age, level of education, and being in a lower income job can affect your vulnerability to misinformation. And on top of this, surveys indicate that many people are far more worried about the impact of misinformation on society and on their friends and family than they are on themselves, meaning that they may not feel the need to improve their own media literacy, even if, in fact, they may have a lot to benefit. So taking all of these together, there's a clear role for some inspired marketing to encourage a sense of curiosity and skepticism among adults when it comes to thinking about where their news comes from. So to summarise, efforts to improve adult media literacy really need to address a diverse range of backgrounds and motivations. They have to be designed to engage primarily and to be accessible to a variety of online news consumers, very much including your older age groups and those from less advantaged areas. Building strong cross-disciplinary partnerships can really help us to reach people where they are, and consulting with communities can help ensure resources and delivery suit what will work best for any particular group or environment, focusing on fewer, simpler elements rather than trying to do too much. And one last thing that I wanted to mention from our experience evaluating the Newswise programme is the value of setting very clear objectives and complementing this with a detailed evaluation framework right from the start. It might sound a bit boring, but it really helped us to demonstrate the impact of that programme in its first year on children's critical engagement with the news, even within just 1 year of delivery, as you'll have seen from some of the findings that Angie shared a bit earlier on. More recently, we found it really useful to consult with other initiatives working towards similar goals to see where we might be able to share our learning and maybe use some similar outcome measures. And again, I'm anticipating a session at the end of the day, but just to say I think this is so important because it should help us build a growing evidence base for future work in this area. There is still a real need for more research into the most effective strategies for educating adults from all backgrounds about recognising false information, and I think evaluation has a key role to play in this. So I hope that very brief review has provided a few useful insights into this topic. I don't know if we're going to do questions now or move on to the next session, but either ask, we've got time for questions if there are any. Yes.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I just wanted to ask if you do any focus on intergenerational work and if that helps, because I found with students at the university, they were often getting messages from their parents. Many of these students were overseas, so their parents were in Indonesia or in India, and they were getting messages, oh, we've seen this on WhatsApp, don't take paracetamol, it's laced with poison. And they were like, no, mum and dad, come on. And they were teaching them that way. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any advice.
Actually, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's one thing I forgot to mention, and that is the way that the Newswise programme is building in its some family news literacy workshops. They were trialled at the Hay Festival this year, and we're about to take them nationwide. So we're really excited to see how that might work. That will be a way of kind of combining the Newswise workshops that take place in schools with inviting parents to come along and learn with their children about improving their news literacy. And I think intergenerational learning is a really brilliant way of doing it. Thank you.
What is the impact of the narcissism effect, so to speak, on media literacy, particularly from the perspective of young people?
Could you explain narcissism effect to me a bit more?
So from my perception as a 38-year-old,
Yeah.
I think of the selfie
Yeah.
as a predominant example of the narcissism effect. And my perception is that the engagement of young people with news is linked very much to themselves and putting themselves at the center of the conversation.
I think that's a really fascinating angle to explore, and in the some initial thoughts I've been having about how we might best engage adults, I think some of it might be about making it as relevant to them as possible. The concept of false information and misinformation, how they would feel if they were misrepresented and so on, and then expanding that outwards. That's the only thought I have on that. But yeah, certainly something that I feel would definitely be worth looking into in more depth. I think for me, that third person effect I spoke about earlier, where adults feel they don't fall for fake news or misinformation, it's other people's problem. I think that's a real nut to crack, actually. And that's where I feel the inspired marketing will come in.
I have a question, please. We've gone from, in the UK, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but we've gone in the UK from having uninterest, disinterest in the whole field to a sort of sine wave of interest. So first of all, it started around, I'd say, pornography, child safety, hate speech. We've gone through waves and entered into a new era about fake news. And we now have a situation where government departments, we have, I think, 3, who have standing round tables looking at media literacy. And it's interesting to see why this isn't more joined up. And I'm just wondering, your work clearly is sort of cross-cutting, but whether how you can proceed in an environment where everybody seems to want a piece of the action, and goodness knows how long that'll be for, because I think it's really worrying. Sorry, I'm a non-exec on the UK National Commission for UNESCO, and so looking at it from our perspective, I'm slightly concerned about the apparent explosion of interest.
I would just, what your question, I suppose, makes me immediately think about is going back to one of the first slides on partnership working. So one of the things that I think we've mentioned already is our news literacy network, which was set up as part of the Newswise programme and involves people from lots of different, industry backgrounds, academic backgrounds, and so on. And I would say that as part of that work, we speak regularly to government departments, to all the different government departments, and we contribute to, we send in submissions to white papers and so on. I think it's so important that if you are working in this field, you collaborate as often and as regularly as you possibly can. So for me, I suppose it's a positive thing that there's interest from lots of different groups at the moment, and it's just our responsibility to make sure that we hear what everybody has to say and make contributions where we can.